Hey, time out. Whether there's proof or no proof, you should still have faith and believe in God. CJ, we love you, brother, but you're wrong. We have to be able to examine evidence, because if we don't, we can claim anything and people will believe it. Yo, time out. I know what happened. They killed the wrong person, and then the real Jesus saw this as an opportunity to make people think that he was God, and so he stole the body. That is quite the theory, but I think you've been watching a little bit too much Monty Python, so we're gonna dive in a bit deeper and see what actually happened. Hey everyone, my name is Josh. Welcome to Overtime, a series of videos where we look at some of the most popular comments in the comment section on our Time Out series, and we do a deep dive to unpack the conversation a bit more and have some dialogue. Now, if you're a Christian watching this video, we hope you'll walk away feeling encouraged about your faith, and if you're not a believer, we hope you'll at least better understand the positions we hold and why we believe them. In the last Time Out video, some arguments for proof of Jesus' resurrection were examined. However, one of the things I noticed in the comments and discussions is that there are some people that doubt Jesus' historicity at all, let alone the idea that he was crucified. The aim of this video is to show why it is highly likely that the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the one that we read about in the Gospels, was actually a historical person. That is, he existed. Now, whenever you make a claim of any sort, the burden of proof is on you as the one making the claim. You have to provide solid evidence that shows your interpretation of that evidence is enough to be correct. It's important to point out the difference between proof versus evidence when we talk about something like this. The stuff we are about to examine constitutes as evidence, not necessarily proof. Now, proof is a fact that demonstrates something to be real or true, while evidence is information that might lead one to believe something to be real or true. So let's go ahead and look at some evidence for Jesus' existence. We'll start in the Gospels, and we do this because these are historical documents. Yes, they are asserting specific points. Yes, they are making supernatural claims, and yes, they are written to convince you that Jesus is the Son of God. However, that doesn't mean that they weren't written by real people in a real place during a real time, and so therefore we can actually get some real historical things out of them. There are 4 accounts of Jesus' life and ministry in the Christian Bible, which means we have 4 different documents to examine. There's some brief things for you to know about these documents, so we'll start with Matthew. Most scholars assert that Matthew was written sometime between 80 and 90 AD. When we move to Mark, Mark is actually the first of the Gospels written. Most scholars agree that it was written sometime around 70 AD, right around the time the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple. Luke, most scholars assert that Luke was written sometime between 80 and 90 AD, like Matthew, and John reached its final form somewhere between 90 and 117 AD, and this is what most scholars believe. So the majority of scholars, when considering the Gospels now, attribute them to the category of ancient Greco-Roman biographies. This is the same genre that Plutarch's Life of Alexander and Life of Caesar represent. Typically, biographies in antiquity were written soon after the death of the subject, including important history about that subject. Jesus' death, for example, would fit this. The fact that these Gospels are written within one lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth bears witness to the likelihood that he existed as a human being and was indeed crucified. Now, turning out of the Gospels for a moment to the writings of the Apostle Paul, there are 7 specific Pauline epistles that are considered by scholarship to have been written by Paul himself. They are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. And then there are 2 letters upon which scholars are evenly divided as to whether Paul himself wrote them or not: Colossians and 2 Thessalonians. So finally, there are letters that divide scholarship on whether or not Paul wrote them at all: Ephesians and 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. Now, when we consider 1 Thessalonians to be written some 20 years after the death of Jesus, we're left with a really interesting set of notions to consider. The textual evidence of this letter reads of a group of people who have been gathering based around a central tenet or point, which we find in 1 Thessalonians 4:14, which reads, "We believe that Jesus died and rose again." Now, this text doesn't prove that Jesus is indeed God. It does show that there was some circulation of a Jesus-based tradition that was going around well before Paul wrote about it in this letter. What this would tell us then is that the individual Paul would either have genuinely believed that what he experienced on the road to Damascus was real and it changed his life and he went around telling people it, or that he intentionally made something up and spent the rest of his life going around telling people that just to be killed for it. Now again, let me say the idea here isn't necessarily to prove that Paul was correct about what he experienced, but it is to show that it is far more likely that what he experienced was real to him, and he confirmed it with other followers of Jesus at the time, i.e. the 12 apostles that you can read about in the book of Acts. And from there, Paul went around preaching to all the people that would have him and listen to him. And so to base all of that in what the disciples knew to be false is really hard for me to buy, but you can consider the evidence for yourself. Now, as we turn out of the Bible sources and we continue on to what are called extra-biblical sources, we're able to look at non-Christian sources specifically that are used to study and establish the historicity of Jesus, including the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historian Tacitus, and some other Jewish-specific texts. These sources are compared to Christian sources, such as the Pauline letters and the Synoptic Gospels, and they're usually independent of each other. That is to say, the Jewish sources do not draw upon the Roman sources. Similarities and differences differences between these sources are used in the authentication process. Now, in books 18 and 20 of the Antiquities of the Jews, written somewhere around 93 to 94 AD, Josephus twice refers to the biblical Jesus. The general scholarly view holds that the longer passage, known as the Testimonium Flavinium, most likely consists of an authentic nucleus that was subjected to later Christian interpolation. On the other hand, Josephus scholar Louis Feldman states that few have doubted the genuineness of the reference in Antiquities 29:1, which reads, quote, "the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James," unquote. Tacitus, in his Annals, written somewhere around 115 AD, book 15, chapter 44, describes Nero's scapegoating of the Christians following the fire of Rome. He writes that the founder of the sect was named Christus, which is the Christian title for Jesus, and Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate, and that the movement, initially checked, broke out again in Judea and even in Rome itself. Now we have the Mishnah. The Mishnah, which is written somewhere around 200 AD, may refer to Jesus and reflect the early Jewish traditions of portraying Jesus as a sorcerer or a magician. Other references to Jesus and his execution exist in the Talmud, but they aim to discredit his actions, not deny his existence. All of this is to say what? Is it possible that the historical Jesus of Nazareth is a made-up individual? Of course, anything is potentially possible. The question we are trying to get to, though, is what is most probable? Now, whatever you think about the message of the people promulgating Jesus is a discussion for a different video. However, what is crystal clear is that the totality of history seems to tip the scales in favor of Jesus being a historical person. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you in the comments.